The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Caroline Frederickson on her book, The Democracy Fix: How to Win the Fight for Fair Rules, Fair Courts, and Fair Elections. Plus, Bill Press talks with Axios reporter Jonathan Swan, who's covering the Trump administration's coronavirus response. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Despite representing a minority of the American public, conservatives are in power across the country. In her book, The Democracy Fix, author Caroline Frederickson tells us how it happened and how to turn it around. And we say hello to Caroline Fredrickson, Senior Fellow at the Brennan Center and the author, most recently, of The Democracy Fix: How to Win the Fight for Fair Rules, Fair Courts, and Fair Elections. Caroline Fredrickson, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
It's a total pleasure to be with you.
And the pleasure is ours. Now, this book stems from an alarming observation, which is that Republican power vastly exceeds the public support for their ideas. First of all, where is this power located?
Well, let me say, actually, the better way to formulate it is that what Republicans get much better than progressives, the left, Democrats, and whatever grouping you want to assemble them, is that power is the first thing that matters. Too often, the left spends its time debating policy details, getting into nuances, and I don't want to diminish those things. Those are important. But that has to come after you figure out how to gain and keep power. And what the Republican project has been for decades has been constructing mechanisms to ensure that they take over the instruments of government and other very important institutional players like the media and control them for the long term to set the terms to enable their policies to be dominant. So yes, they don't reflect what the majority of Americans want. I mean, look who's president now. He has a minority of support in this country, and yet a majority of the ability to have an impact. So that's come about from decades of work, hard work, planning, and follow through on the right.
Now, one of the important elements of your book is to give a roadmap of how we got to this point today. And we have to talk about Lewis Powell. Who was he, and what did he do that was so significant?
Well, it's so interesting because Lewis Powell is now often looked at in a kind of a nostalgic way by legal writers. He was a Supreme Court justice at later in his career. But right before he was nominated to the Supreme Court, he was a corporate lawyer in Richmond, Virginia, a corporate lawyer who represented big tobacco, a corporate lawyer who served on various high-level committees at the Chamber of Commerce, and he was an alarmist about the state of the free market and capitalism in America at the end of the 60s and early 70s. And what he saw was the progress that the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement had made in America, but also the consumer movement, and that these movements were achieving successes not only legislatively but also through litigation. They were in the courts, and they were winning in ways that was putting a check on corporate America, putting a check on pollution, discrimination, violation of safety controls for consumers. Ralph Nader is obviously, very well associated with that moment. I mean, he was a hero for driving so I should say, sort of, I don't mean to make a pun, but driving the reform effort to make sure that we had safer cars by suing the big auto companies for their dangerous products. And so there was a moment where, Lewis Powell thought that somehow that we were going to become a communist country and that the free market was being reined in excessively. And so he wrote a fairly famous memo known as the Powell Memo. Very easy to find. If anyone's interested, I recommend you can just look for it online. It's available online in his archives. What he does there is he wrote this memo to one of his colleagues at the Chamber of Commerce, laying out an agenda for the right, for corporate America, for the wealthy, for those who wanted to fight against labor unions and the advances of consumers. And basically, he did lay out a roadmap for how the right would control power over the long term. And he recognizes that there were key instruments, the courts, the media, and think tanks were his primary focus. But this all led into a lot of electoral work, as well as one of the institutions that they built out of this was ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and groups like the Chamber of Commerce, which not only established a major litigation arm to bring cases in front of the Supreme Court to lay a roadmap for right-wing decisions, but also got into the game of gerrymandering and supporting campaign efforts to take over state houses to ensure that the district maps could be weighted in their direction. So it was really a vision that he had, which was not about what's the tax rate that corporations should pay, nothing or low. That was their end goal. They knew that they were looking for no regulation, way lower taxes, restrictions on union organizing, no effective enforcement of anti-discrimination law. But the mechanisms were, let's make sure we have courts that are hospitable to our arguments. That means we need the judges, we need the arguments, so we need to bring the cases. This all takes a lot of time. We need to build think tanks that are going to develop policy proposals to give to policymakers, that is, elected officials who get elected under our efforts to rig the votes and gerrymander the districts. And it's a very nicely functioning system. As a result, they got so much of what they wanted, whereas the left, never built this kind of infrastructure, never thought sort of 5, 10, 20 years out, whereas the right, really had this mapped out over a period of time, recognizing none of this stuff was going to be immediate.
And so here we are 50 years or so after the Powell Memo. We now have an expansive, finely tuned ecosystem of conservative political power. Who are some of the key players that have emerged over the years?
Well, it's no surprise to anybody who's listening to say that the Koch brothers were very instrumental in all of this, because one of the things that Powell recognized was that there needed to be funding. So there needed to be right-wing philanthropy brought in to help finance the building of these new institutions. So the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, ALEC were key building blocks of his vision. Another person who I think is really interesting and maybe a little bit less well known is somebody named Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich was one of the original people who came together around the Powell Memo, seeking to kind of take the memo and instrumentalize it. And he was quite an interesting character, because he was not only somebody who worked with Jerry Falwell to found the so-called moral majority, but he also founded ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Committee, and was deeply involved in many of the other organizations. He saw the nexus between using the kind of right-wing evangelical voters and their interests as the kind of the ground troops of corporate America's efforts. That is, they didn't have the voters, and the voters were not going to necessarily support a low tax, low regulation agenda as the major motivating force for their votes. But if corporate America could fund an election strategy that basically took on issues like abortion and school prayer and busing, race and gender essentially as motivating issues as we know them still to be today. So they used those to bring in these evangelical voters, and they funded it through corporate treasuries and the funds from the wealthy, knowing that what they were going to get out of it was not just conservative social policy, but more importantly to them, a deregulatory state and the destruction of a lot of protections for labor and consumers and so forth. And so Paul Weyrich was just a kind of a very interesting person. He I quote him in the book because he helps lay some of this out in numerous forums, but one of them that was most significant was when Ronald Reagan was running for president. Paul Weyrich was at a evangelical rally for Reagan, and he got up and he said, there are people who think that more people should be voting in this country. I don't think so. He says, when fewer people vote, we do better. When basically those people vote, we do worse. And so, he not only injects a kind of issue of race into a way of getting evangelical voters to vote, but also, admits that vote suppression is a key part of their strategy. That is, they know that they're not in the majority. They know that they're the minority. And the way that you keep winning is that you restrict voting access so that your group overcomes the numbers on the other side. So Paul Weyrich was, was kind of a brilliant thinker in some ways, evil, of course, but constructing both ALEC, which, I think your listeners may be familiar with as the authors of not only all sorts of terrible gerrymandering bills and anti-environmental fracking and so forth, but also the stand your ground laws. They are, an organization on the forefront of retrograde conservative legislative policies and have been disseminating them across the country since they were founded by, as part of this whole vision, the Lewis Powell memo vision.
Now, the book is in part a constructive critique of progressive politicians. In fact, one reviewer summed it up this way, that the right has a long-term plan and the left didn't. How did the left get it so wrong?
Well, I think the left, I think we have to understand in some ways, what we are. It's different. It's harder on our side. It's harder because of the good parts, right? We are more diverse. We have,
I was going to say because we like other people.
Because we're not all white, wealthy men, at the top running this. The Chamber of Commerce was not a diverse organization, and the people who founded it, Paul Weyrich and the Koch brothers and Ed Meese and the people running the Chamber of Commerce, there wasn't much to distinguish them from each other. Certainly not race and sex and socioeconomic status. So there's a real unity of purpose and shared desire for specific outcomes that would benefit all of them. I think on the left, our great strength is also our weakness in this area, which is that people have lots of different interests and are in different places based on their circumstances. And what that has somewhat obscured, unfortunately, is that all of us should be sharing a common agenda about power. That our common agenda is to achieve greater justice in America, more equality, a better environment, a fairer workplace, more diverse representation, more representative representation. And all that requires us to really focus on the mechanisms of gaining power. That is, we need to really invest, at first, first thing we should be working on is making sure that our system of elections functions. The second thing needs to be that our courts are fair, and that means we need to make sure that we engage at least as hard as the right does in making sure that we get, on the federal level, people nominated and confirmed. We fight like hell for them, and they need to be good progressives. We need to make sure at the state court level that we are investing at least as much in elections where judges are elected, or in nominations and confirmations where they're part of a merit selection process. We just don't do that. We haven't been spending as much, have focused as much on state house elections, which has had really damaging impact on the redistricting process, meaning that the Republicans control way more seats in the House of Representatives than they should, even though they're not in the majority anymore. They still have way more votes than they should based on the share of the population that votes for Republicans. All of those things are really essential. We have done some things in terms of building think tanks, but it's still not enough. There still needs to be, kind of the policies that flow to the elected officials that are concrete, that are specific. But really, at most essential is those mechanisms of controlling power. And we've got to focus on that first. And all of the debates about specific policies, those have to come after.
We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're talking with Caroline Fredrickson about her book, The Democracy Fix. Stay with us for part 2 of our conversation. But right now we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Wartime profiteering has been as common in our country as war itself. Indeed, during the American Revolution, assorted corrupt merchants and traders lined their pockets by controlling the supply and jacking up the prices on various goods they sold to the Continental Army and to the general public. Often, though, feisty colonials struck back at the gougers. In 1777, for example, when a Boston merchant was found to be hoarding imports of coffee and sugar to create an artificial shortage so he could charge exorbitant prices to the area's families, a band of enraged Beantown women took matters into their own hands. They beat up the guy and confiscated his stock. It's time for indignant citizens today to confront a new breed of shameful greed merchants, pandemic profiteers. Such corporate scammers as Boeing, American Airlines, and Marriott have rushed to Washington, shoving aside millions of devastated victims of the COVID-19 crisis to demand that corporations be first in line for a massive government rescue. Take Boeing, please. Its lobbyists brazenly swarmed the Capitol, pleading for $60 billion from taxpayers to protect its profits. Rather than being laughed out of town, such socialist capitalists have been handed $500 billion of our money. Which corporations will be favored? No telling. How much would they get? They'll tell us later, maybe. What's the criteria? Don't ask. What about their workers and suppliers? Let them apply for food stamps. Aren't you cutting food stamps? Shh. This is Jim Hightower saying the greedy profiteering giants should not have been given a single dime until the real and urgent needs of the people are met. Profiteers should be last in line, or turned over to descendants of those Boston women from 1777 colonial America.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, part 2 of our conversation with Caroline Fredrickson about her book, The Democracy Fix: How to Win the Fight for Fair Rules, Fair Courts, and Fair Elections. The book suggests that progressives can learn from the conservative playbook. But can progressives do that and not sacrifice democratic values along the way?
Well, I say we need to focus on power. What they do when they focus on power is recognizing that their power is not in their numbers, is to engage in mechanisms to suppress the vote. So, for example, all these voter ID proposals, they try and cloak them in all sorts of neutral language about how it's trying to save us from the voter fraud that they've never established really exists in America, but instead is designed to make it harder for certain communities, particularly communities of color, to vote. They attack early voting. They look at what just happened in Texas, right? So making it harder to vote by having the communities that are going to vote for Democrats have fewer voting machines, have to wait in longer lines, deter people from voting. They engage in vicious gerrymandering to ensure that the districts are skewed in such a way that they're going to elect Republicans, even if overall the numbers would elect a Democrat. So I'm not suggesting we do that. What I am suggesting is that we really focus on those same areas, that is elections, make them fair. We're going to win fair elections because we have the numbers on our side, a system where there's automatic voter registration, where access to the voting booth is easy. We have a system, either we're going to give people a free ID or we're going to use the same fraud protection mechanisms we've used till now, which have been very effective. We need to make sure our elections are secure from foreign interference, invest in cybersecurity mechanisms, which the Democrats on the Hill have been fighting for and the Republicans have been resisting for obvious reasons. I guess they want Vladimir Putin to come in and put a finger on the scale on their side. We need to. I think what Eric Holder has been doing has been really right on target. His new group, not so new, but a couple of years old, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, has been working to invest in campaigns at the state level so that more Democrats get elected to state houses. That means that when the redistricting process comes after the 2020 census, Democrats can actually play a role. And what they're doing is focusing on nonpartisan redistricting commissions. Again, the numbers are on our side. We don't need to play dirty pool. We should be focused on mechanisms that are fair. And I'd say that not only because we can and we can still win, but also because I think if we don't, we're going to look just as sleazy and just as unprincipled as the Republicans. And in fact, nonpartisan redistricting commissions are in not our interests, but also in our values. And so I think embracing those kinds of reforms, putting them at the front and center as the most important things we need to work on, that has to be issue number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 for Democrats.
That was a long part of that, every one of those on the list. When returning more integrity to our electoral process gets a lot of attention in the book, and in the face of gerrymandering and voter suppression, so we're talking about best strategies that you see to do that. I mean, even better messaging to just get more people out to vote, making sure more people get to vote. Now, that takes a lot of work because there are all these states, as you mentioned, Texas, also not allowing students. If you have a student ID, you can't vote, but if you have a gun license you can and crazy things like this. But there are things that we can do. Maybe it's going around to your neighborhood and making sure everybody's got a ride to the polls. Little things like that. But the messaging is what kills me with the left. We're not messaging in the right way. We're not pointing out these egregious things that are happening on the right that are keeping the people on the left down.
Absolutely. And one of the things I write about in my book, and I do have a chapter on the media, because building Fox News and that whole ecosystem was a big part of their strategy. I mean, Lewis Powell identified the media as a major factor, and he attacked the media as being that existed at the time as being way left leaning, and even though it was just it was the establishment trying to be even handed. And they attacked it to sort of suggest that it was biased by reporting the truth. And we see, where that has gone. And Fox News has really just amped that up to an excessive level. But what we don't have on the left is a sort of a counter that's effective. And it's interesting to me because it seems like we have all the tools. The most creative people in America seem to be liberals engaged in the entertainment industry, and thinking about how John Oliver or Stephen Colbert or other comedians, Samantha Bee, how effective they can be at framing political issues. Why isn't that we can't do more of that? I mean, the other side uses screaming, yelling guys. It doesn't resonate much on the left. But can we use comedy? Can we engage? Why aren't we investing more in communication strategies that speak to people in a way that we like to be talked to? On political issues. That seems to me a real oversight. And there needs to be better messaging using all of those tools and all of those instruments that we have that seem to be neglected in the political sphere and only have been used primarily to advance, corporate interests. All the high-tech people who are working for big companies who lean Democratic, and yet we don't have a great infrastructure for using technology to advance Democratic ends. Unlike, Trump's campaign, which has been brilliant, unfortunately in a very sleazy, unethical, and illegal way, most likely, to manipulate social media in his favor. We need to be aggressive, not unethical and sleazy, but aggressive in thinking about how social media, how television, radio, other tools can actually advance Democrats and being creative. We have the creative types.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason to just blatantly lie to people. I mean, that's, it's working for some people, but it doesn't need to work that way. I want to turn to the courts. How can progressives regain lost ground there?
Well, I mean, number one, we need to make that a clear element of our political agenda. I think the left for too long has sort of set the courts aside as if they're not part of this project of ensuring a fair, just America. They're actually a critical factor. They're just as important as legislative votes. They're just as important as a vote for the executive, for the president. The courts not only are a branch of government, but their impact can be outsized because on the federal level, they have a lifetime appointment. These judges serve for life. We have Brett Kavanaugh until he dies, unless he resigns earlier. And he's, only in his mid-50s. So based on life expectancy now, we could have him for more than 30 years on the court. That's why we have to care. And that means when we do have a Democratic president, it has to be an absolutely essential priority to move judges through the system, to get good progressives nominated and confirmed, and not to put it on the back burner the way that President Obama did. I mean, he can be credited with lots of things, but he cannot be given credit for taking an aggressive posture with respect to the courts. When he came in, he had a supermajority in the Senate and failed to use it, failed to nominate people, just did not take an interest in it, and Democrats on the Hill are to be faulted as well. I hope they've learned their lesson as they've seen what Donald Trump has done. Because Obama was blocked from filling many vacancies at the end of his presidency. Donald Trump was given a gift basket.
And you talk about egregious at the end of his presidency. Needless to say, the Supreme Court should not look the way that it does had things been done as they've always been done in history. That's
absolutely right. So they blocked the appointment of Merrick Garland to fill Scalia's seat when Obama was president by making up some new doctrine, which they've swiftly abandoned now that Trump is president, about how you can't nominate somebody during a presidential election year. So that's out the window. They filled that seat. They got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees and filled that seat with Gorsuch. And then there was Kavanaugh. But there was also very significantly a whole lot of vacancies because Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, had blocked Obama from filling all the other vacancies as well by using all sorts of Senate tactics and just being obstructionist. And so Donald Trump was presented this opportunity to just fill a lot of judgeships, and he knew that he could do both things. He turned to the Federalist Society. They gave him a long list of crazy right-wing lawyers who could fill these slots, and they moved them through. At the same time as he was doing all of his other crazy things and tweeting all the time, they could actually, sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. Democrats, on the other hand, seem to think that you can only do legislation or judges, and you can't do them both at the same time, and therefore, let's just focus on legislation. So it's just really a misunderstanding of how to have an impact. So, much of it is that we, the voters, need to really tell the members that it's like enough is enough. This has got to be, if they don't take an interest and a passionate interest in the courts, they shouldn't get your support. They shouldn't get your support. They should care about, not only getting these, judgeships filled, but making sure that the people who fill them are committed progressives who understand the Constitution's core values of we the people, who are working to ensure a more perfect union. That's what we need. We need that, and they need to move fast. They need to be aggressive. They need to actually fight and not capitulate. And there's a lot of blame to go around, and I could name specific senators who have done little. Many of whom who supported Trump's nominees, even though they were terrible, just because. Why? I don't know.
There's a lot of head scratching going on all over the place. And right here in my own chair, every day I see things and just think, are you kidding me? Now, I want to say, this is a very powerful history that you've put together. But do you ever imagine what kind of nation we might be now if this conservative takeover didn't happen?
Yeah, well, all the time. For one thing, the book is called The Democracy Fix. So on core issues of democracy, starting back with a case called Buckley v. Vallejo in the 70s, which was one of the first cases dealing with campaign finance issues, which was a major victory for the right, even though it's not recognized as that so often, because it established the idea that money is speech. Something that was a really radical idea at the time. It established that giving money to a candidate was equivalent to free speech, and made it considerably harder to regulate the funding of campaigns. And that was, sort of starting with that, if there had been a time, if Democrats, if the left had really been focused on the courts and had been really focused on mechanisms of democracy, that at that point, there's a whole set of cases that came after. Citizens United is the one people know much better, but that was a follow-on. Free Speech Now, which allowed the billionaires to basically do all of these independent expenditures, the super PACs and all of that. Shelby County, which tore down the Voting Rights Act, which has made it incredibly hard to fight voter suppression now. A recent case from last year where the Supreme Court said, nah, you can't really regulate gerrymandering. It's bad, but, we can't do anything about it. So just looking at those cases to say, if the left had the same vision, had been fighting for the courts, and had understood that the core mechanisms of democracy were our essential focus, we'd have a system where we still had a Voting Rights Act, where those long lines in Texas would have been illegal because they were clearly the way that the Texas legislature and the election administrators were operating was to make it harder for people of color to vote. We would have a system where those kinds of denials of access to voting would actually still, we could get at them through the Department of Justice and through the Voting Rights Act. We would be able to ensure fair districts in the states. So the whole layout of politics would be different. You'd have states with their congressional delegation have many more Democrats in them, because all of a sudden, a state like Wisconsin, which is so highly gerrymandered, would now have a delegation that reflected the interests of the population. So those I think are other. I mean, there are clearly lots of other things that flow from that, but I think those things flow from the essential, which is a creation of a democracy that actually functions.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Well, before we let you go, let's talk about what's really at stake here. I mean, what is your biggest concern if progressive activists, donors, lawmakers don't figure out a way to really matter again?
Well, I mean, where do we even start? I am really worried about locking in an authoritarian system for the long term. We'll have a democracy that has sort of the trappings of an electoral process, but in fact, where it's so hard for so many people to vote that the right can always control the outcome. I'm deeply worried about that, which has consequences for so many things. I mean, our environment. What are we going to do about our global warming situation, about the climate crisis? We can't actually have a legislature that's responsive to the interests of the people. We're going to have, I think, we see that the Republican leadership in the thrall of the far right religious community, which wants to make life impossible for LGBTQ, transgender, and other people. Women are going to lose access to their reproductive rights. And this all sounds very alarmist, except that it's all happening. There have been any number of court cases that have been moving in that direction, and the court yesterday just heard a challenge to Roe v. Wade from Louisiana. This is all on its way. So, the moment is now. I mean, I think people are responding. Donald Trump is so scary that the left is waking up. And I hope that is enough to make sure that the outcomes in November give us the ability to start fixing some of these things. It's going to be hard on the courts.
Oh, yeah.
Because those are lifetime appointments.
Yeah. Oh,
but Donald Trump for 4 years can't do as much as Donald Trump in 8 years to transform the courts. But he has already had an enormous impact.
Right. Oh, yeah. The handprint on the court system is going to go long beyond however long he's in office. Caroline Frederickson, Senior Fellow at the Brennan Center and the author most recently of The Democracy Fix, How to Win the Fight for Fair Rules, Fair Courts, and Fair Elections, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Caroline, we certainly appreciate your time with us today, and we look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Trump versus reality. Bill Press talks with Axios reporter Jonathan Swan.
So, Jonathan, let's start with the little bit of breaking news. The interview you did, extraordinary interview with the Chinese ambassador to the United States. Overall, coming out of that interview, what impression did you get about the current state of relations between the United States and China?
About as bad as they've been ever. I mean, certainly in modern memory, you have a virus that is killing people all over the world, and then you have a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson who is on the record saying that the U.S. seeded this virus, that they made it, concocted it in a military laboratory in the United States, and then planted it in Wuhan. And then you have the United States president calling it the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, etc., which many Chinese people find very offensive. So you have basically a propaganda war going on at the same time as a virus is ravaging people all over the world. It's pretty bad.
Is there any truth to the charge that China knew about it and did not tell us about it or the world about it?
Oh, absolutely. Look, to be clear, Trump says they should have told us 3 months earlier. That's nonsense. That the virus didn't exist for that long. But what is a stone cold fact is that for 3 weeks, and these are very critical weeks. This is at the start of a pandemic. You talk to any epidemiologist, they will tell you that you need to stamp it out at the very beginning, and it's very important to share information. So in December, doctors in Wuhan started raising alarms about this respiratory virus that was very, very dangerous. Instead of listening to them and putting out this information, the authorities actually hauled them into the police station, forced them to put out these sort of confessionals saying that their information was false. Chinese censors censored social media, scrubbing references to the virus. And then the Chinese government put out false information. January 15th, they said that it was unlikely to spread on state television, unlikely to spread from human to human. This is more than 2 weeks after doctors starting raising alarm and doctors were finding that it spread human to human. And in that period, you had millions of people leaving Wuhan without any screening. And that's how, in this globalized world, it spread the way it did. So absolutely, those first 3 weeks were critical, and the Chinese government covered it up.
And the one doctor who tried to raise warnings about it?
He died.
Silent?
Well, there were more than one. Right. There was actually 8 doctors who were hauled in, but the famous doctor is Dr. Li Wenliang, who sounded the alarm. Instead of being listened to, he was hauled into the police station, forced to sign and fingerprint a confessional saying that he was putting out untrue facts. And then he died. He died of the coronavirus. Young guy. Really tragic situation.
It looks like, at least they're telling us now, that China has no new cases and they seem to have it under control. Could A, do you believe that's true? And B, could the United States ever do what China has done in order to get this behind us?
So, I think there's no doubt that what China has done after those first 3 weeks has mitigated the virus in China, perhaps to an extraordinary extent. I mean, they shut down a province, Hubei province, they shut down cities. And we don't know, we can't trust the data coming out of China. It's just not something you can take gospel for. So we don't know what the exact figures are. But I think from a directional trend point of view, when you talk to epidemiologists, they do say that China has got a really strong grip on this virus. But this is what you can do in an authoritarian society. I mean, I don't know if you saw the footage of it, but what they were doing was they were going door to door in Wuhan, hauling people out. If you have a temperature bill, they knock on your door, they will literally drag you, no matter what you want, kicking and screaming into quarantine.
Yeah,
Now,
I saw.
epidemiologists will say, as a public health thing, it's quite effective. Turns out when you haul people out of their homes and stick them somewhere, you can get a lot of stuff done. I don't know how that would fly in New York City, or in California.
Now, I can tell you how it would fly.
But Bill, on your question, there's some really interesting public health. So what we're seeing now in some of the more authoritarian countries is the way they're using technology to combat this virus. I mean, it can be very effective when you have a compliant population that's used to being completely obedient to the government. So Singapore is a really good example. They've done a fantastic job in limiting. We only saw the first 2 deaths in the last week. And what they're doing, a friend of mine who lives there sent me the thing on WhatsApp. So the government's communicating every day with citizens on WhatsApp. They've created an app that you download on your phone. And you have to switch your Bluetooth on, Bill. And what it does is you'll walk around and it will ping. So if someone, later tests positive to the coronavirus, they will trace that person through their Bluetooth interactions. And anyone who's been within 6 feet of them will get notified by the government.
Wow.
So that's the sort of stuff you're seeing in Singapore. Now, that's a voluntary app. But on the mandatory side, when people have been arriving into Singapore, they've had to quarantine at home for 14 days. But it's not just like, in America where you'd say, okay, guys, the government would say, please do this. The government's absolutely enforcing it. I mean, they'll get text messages or WhatsApps, and they have to send the government their GPS location to prove that they're at home. And if they don't, they could face jail time or a fine. So that's the sort of measures that you're seeing in some of these countries.
Wow, that's astounding, and that you'll never see here.
Not compatible.
Right. So, at more than one point, Jonathan, your interview with the ambassador got a little testy, particularly when you asked him very legitimately about a reporter who's gone missing.
Mr. Ambassador, we're talking about information getting out to the public. I have to ask you about some journalists that have disappeared. Where is the citizen journalist Chen Cho-she? He was doing some of the early videos from inside Wuhan that was showing the response to the virus and the chaos that was happening inside Wuhan.
I have not heard of this person.
Really? Chen Cho-she?
Why not?
Well, you were asked about him on Face the Nation on February the 9th.
No, I was not asked about any particular journalist.
You were. She named Margaret. I watched the clip. Margaret Brennan named Chen Cho-she. You were asked.
But I did not know him then. I don't know him now.
Well, it's a month later. Weren't you curious to find out who he was?
We have 1.4 billion people back in China. How can I learn everything about everybody?
I'm not asking you to. I'm saying this is a journalist who has been written about in the New York Times, the international media. His family and friends want to know where he is. You haven't been curious to inquire about his whereabouts?
My responsibility is to manage our relation with the United States. As for domestic situation, we have people back in China who are dealing with these issues. And we have the judiciary departments that are dealing with these issues. So why not let people do their own job?
Could you possibly believe that he never heard of this guy?
No, and that's why, I thought he would have a good cover story here, because the reason I asked this question is he was asked specifically about Chen Cho-she on Face the Nation on February 9th. And he said he claimed then that he didn't know who he was. It was implausible then, Bill, because Chen Cho-she has been all over the international media, the New York Times, the BBC, pick an international media outlet. I mean, the ambassador's a very sophisticated man. He's reading the international press. The chances that he's not aware of these Chinese journalists who've just disappeared, strangely disappeared after they started doing critical reporting about the government from inside Wuhan. So I asked him, he said, I never heard of him. And I said, really? That's funny. You were asked about him on this day. And then, and then he went down this strange track where he said, there are 1.4 billion people in China. I can't be expected to keep touch with everyone. I said, that's really not what I'm asking you to do. That's also not what I'm trying to ask you to do. Yeah. It's quite different. But on a serious note, this is really, the reason this is important is when you talk about those early 3 weeks, it's not just a matter of, the Chinese government often has a a refrain where they say, we don't interfere in your domestic politics, you don't interfere in ours. But when it's a globalized world and when people are getting sick and dying from a disease, it actually is in our interest to know the decisions that were made at the domestic level in those early 3 weeks. It's not just a provincial or domestic issue. It's actually a global issue.
Right. So let's come back home here for the coronavirus. I was at the briefing yesterday, Sunday, at the White House, where President Trump and Vice President Pence made a big deal of we are halfway through the 15-day period that we said we're going to all hunker down and put this thing behind us. We're halfway through. And then about midnight last night, the president tweeted out that maybe we should think about taking a different direction at the end of the 15 days because the cure could be worse than the disease. And you, Jonathan, I give you credit, are the first one that I saw who reported this that they're considering a change in direction at the White House. What's it all mean?
So what's been happening for the last, well, honestly, it's been happening for more than a week now, is that you have a division that's opening up between the president and his political and economic aides versus the public health experts. So you have public health experts who, if it was up to them at the end of the 15-day period, almost certainly would extend a period of some form of social distancing, enforced quarantine, pretty extreme measures to keep the economy in this state of partial shutdown so that people don't get affected. Well, the president and members of his team are very, very anxious about the economy being in this shutdown state. And they are starting to lose patience with that public health guidance. And I foresee a situation based on my reporting in which the 15-day period ends and you have an almighty clash between the Dr. Anthony Fauci's of the world inside the administration and the president and some of his senior aides who are thinking about other factors, not just public health factors, but economic factors. And, it's not illegitimate in the sense of having to weigh these factors because you are making these choices about jobs and all sorts of other things. But the problem is when you talk to public health experts, if they do ignore that and the virus really picks up steam, the economic side of things is not going to work out well in that scenario either.
Right. So what would that mean? Would that mean restaurants would reopen, businesses would reopen, stores would reopen? What do we know?
It sets up this interesting situation where obviously private businesses make their own choices and states are also making their own choices. Right. So you could get this situation where, again, this is a speculative scenario. I'm not saying this will happen, but you could imagine a situation in which the president is giving one set of advice from the White House podium and private industry is taking a whole different direction and certain governors are taking a whole different direction and people don't really know what to think. Should we listen to Dr. Anthony Fauci? Should we listen to the public health experts? Or, if you're a Trump supporter living in rural America, and you believe every word that comes out of President Trump's mouth, do you listen to him? And what does that mean for your health? I mean, that's where I see this heading based on my conversations I've had over the last week.
And the immediate application of that it seems to be on how far we go with, or how far the administration goes with the Defense Production Act, which the president invoked. And yet, again, at the briefing on Sunday, he was clearly very hesitant to actually put force behind it. He said, no, the businesses, private companies are responding on their own. Let's let them do that. We're not going to force them to do anything. So that's, I guess, an example, right, of this difference of opinion within the administration about how far to go.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. Trump has been very reluctant to use those powers. What he isn't reluctant, though, is, and this has been described to me by multiple aides, Trump basically wants to just give out as much cash as he can get away with in this period. He is not, his instincts are not sort of the Herbert Hoover. This is not Herbert Hoover in the White House. It's someone who never really cared about the debt in good times and certainly doesn't care about the debt now, has added $3 trillion to the debt during his presidency and is not thinking along those lines. So he was pushing his aides to come up with a bigger stimulus package in terms of cash handouts.
So you mentioned that he is concerned about the economic impact and therefore maybe a change in direction after the 15 days is up. When you look at the market, which is down at the level where it was when he took office, all of the Trump gains having been lost, when Steve Mnuchin says the unemployment rate could go as high as 20%, when the CDC says as many as 200 million Americans could be infected, is the president also considering the potential political impact?
Oh, of course he is. I mean, they all are. I mean, it'd be impossible not to. And what it's done is it's
worried about it.
Well, his team are. I haven't discussed it with the president, so I don't want to sort of. But his team are worried, and he doesn't tend to express concern or articulate concern in the way that most people would. So his team is definitely concerned about that. Here's what's changed. They were running. Trump used to say this. He might have even said it publicly. He certainly was saying it privately. That it's the Bill Clinton thing. It's the economy's stupid. He was running on lowest unemployment among African Americans, booming stock market, great economy. You might hate me, but look, you can't afford not to have me. Right. Look at my great economy. All that has vanished overnight. And so now he's pivoting into this, I'm a wartime president. We've got this enemy. We've got to bind together and fight the enemy. And so he's having to kind of recalibrate and try and put his own Trumpian spin on this. He's still doing the sort of happy talk, talking up some of these experimental drugs that we don't know if they're going to work or not. He's still trying to talk positive, say that this thing will go away. We're going to get back bigger than ever. But the problem is if that, it's something that's out of his control and the virus isn't responding to his tweets. So if this thing just keeps, God forbid, spreading throughout the communities, it's not something that he can control with his usual toolbox.
Our mutual friend Hunter Walker asked the president the other day what, on a scale of 1 to 10, how he would rate his response or his administration's response to the virus. And the president, of course, automatically said a 10. How would you rate it? I mean, we saw the president at first was reluctant to take this seriously, seemed to be, then definitely said, this is serious. We all got to get together and fight this thing. And now we see again, as you've been reporting, that maybe he wants to loosen up a little bit. Overall, how do you think the administration has responded?
Certainly in the initial period, very, very poorly. Very poorly. They were slow to take this seriously. The president was dismissive of the threat, said that there was no chance of the pandemic and that everything was going to be solved basically because he'd shut off travel with China. And at the department agency level, just utter dysfunction. I mean, getting the tests out has just been completely dysfunctional. Inability to get. We have no idea how far this has spread in the communities because we haven't had adequate testing. We did some early reporting on this when the CDC laboratory in Atlanta that was developing the test, they couldn't get a proper test done, and so the Food and Drug Administration, they sent out someone to check it out, see what was going on. It was a dirty lab. It was contaminated. So they had to pull this out of this laboratory in Atlanta and move it. I mean, the dysfunction is just almost beyond description. Now they're putting their weight behind it. They're going really aggressively at it now, and everyone's involved. But if they pivot out after the 15 days, that could easily be undone, all that progress.
Bill Press talking with Axios reporter Jonathan Swan. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. Well, that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, Caroline Fredrickson and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.